This is Upwell, a new podcast from Only.one, featuring entrepreneurs, advocates, and leaders working to protect and restore the ocean and the planet. And I'm your host, Aaron Kinnery. Today we have Nick Nuttall, Communications Director at We Don't Have Time and the former Head of Communications at the UN Environment Program and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Nick is a global leader in media who's working to elevate the dialogue to drive action on climate. Let's dive in. Nick, thanks for joining Upwell. COP27 just wrapped over the weekend, so I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts coming out of the meeting. But first, the conference was hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and it was framed as Africa's COP. How did the host country help set the tone and focus the agenda for this year's meeting?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of presence of African nations. And I think that with Egypt as the presidency, in a sense, but also in collaboration, I think, with a lot of other countries, they worked very hard to find announcements that would fit into the African setting. And I think one of the big things that Africa wanted was some kind of acknowledgement of the importance of their agricultural systems in the fight against climate change, but also in overcoming, hunger challenges and other related matters. So I think that if this was a COP of anything, it was a COP of Africa, but a COP of Africa through the lens of food and agriculture, actually. And I think everybody else kind of joined in on this a bit because, what with the Ukraine war and the shortage of food that's been seen because of Ukraine being a breadbasket, but also, Russia being a big producer of food. I think the world suddenly realized in all kinds of interesting ways, echoed, of course, in the wake of COVID, that we are a world of very fragile supply lines and that we need to do something to build some resilience into these supply lines against future shocks, whether they be wars or climate extreme weather events, or whether they be other, political incidents that emerge. I think this was a big feature of the COP.
And what were some of the major announcements coming from COP?
Well, you obviously probably heard that the headline one was this decision to create a fund for loss and damage. So to pay developing countries, vulnerable developing countries, for the kind of climate shocks that are already happening in many, whether it be from hurricanes or typhoons or extreme droughts or floods. This has been long a dream of the developing countries to have such a fund. And I must say, I was absolutely, totally surprised that this would ever be agreed, because it's been a long-standing position of the richer countries that having a loss and damage fund agreed might be an open check over the coming years and decades as climate impacts get even more severe. And so I really never thought this would happen. So the fact that it did happen was quite a surprise to me. I mean, we can talk a little bit about that and go into whether this thing will ever have any legs and teeth, probably more like. But I thought that was good. I think there were many, many, many announcements in what you might call the real economy. I thought one of there were just so many. It's impossible to actually categorize the number of events that happened. But, a decision by some of the richer countries to give $20 billion to Indonesia to phase out coal, following up on what happened last year in Glasgow at the last COP26, the UN climate conference in the UK, where $8 billion was given to South Africa to phase out of coal. So I think there's a really serious intent on those. I mean, that actually came out of the G20, but that was, then brought into COP27. I thought that was very interesting. A big initiative by some of the world's biggest shipping companies to be net zero by 2050 by going for green hydrogen. And as you know, there are different colors of hydrogen. So some hydrogen is maybe less clean than others, but green hydrogen is meant to be from renewables. And that they would, halve their emissions by 2030 in terms of shipping. Now, shipping is only 2% of global emissions, but, could grow over the years. So I think that was interesting. The shipping lines came in. I thought there was some good announcements on renewable energy in Africa as well, various funds being set up to support that transition. A country like Tanzania really ramping up their ambition on renewable energy. I think there were many, but there was also quite a lot of food and agricultural announcements. There was an initiative called Restore Africa, and supported by something called Climate Asset Management, which is part of HSBC, the bank. So that was like 14 African countries getting what you might call leverage finance. So you may say $150 million is not a lot, but that hopefully will be leveraged to help them, in a sense, green their agriculture, go for sustainable agriculture. What everyone's now banking on is something with the term regenerative agriculture. And I thought that was a big feature. That was one announcement in relation to that. So those are a few I thought were pretty good. Yeah.
And on the financing front, which was also a big theme at Glasgow last year, I mean, you mentioned the South Africa deal and the Indonesia deal. There was also a preview of one that's forthcoming, likely in Vietnam, that will be modeled after both of these. Should we expect to continue to see more of these financing arrangements going forward, and also continue to see business playing a bigger role in some of these negotiations?
I think business has been playing a role for a long time. I mean, I don't think the landmark Paris Agreement of 2015 would perhaps have happened, or there would have been a struggle to make it happen, to get formally an agreement of all nations to take action on climate change, which is the plan that we're supposed to be following right now, flowing from Paris in 2015. And I don't think that would have happened if you hadn't had CEOs of major corporations saying, we want this, and giving, in a sense, a cover to governments to build their confidence that there would be less, say, political backlash from going for climate change. And I don't know why there would be political backlash anyway, from my point of view, because I think the economics for many years have been built that, climate change is a serious risk to the global economy. And that the costs of inaction will be, far higher than the costs of action. Indeed, the cost of action could actually be a bonus to the economy. So but I think that business was instrumental in Paris, and I think it was here in force again. Some businesses, of course, which weren't so welcome, like a lot of fossil fuel leaders were at Sharm el-Sheikh, but a lot of other very progressive businesses. And of course, many corporations now have set science-based targets, and that's certainly growing, to align themselves with the Paris Agreement. So I think I think business and industry was there in force, saying we want stepped up action on climate change. And and this was the most interesting thing, because there was a huge row at one moment about whether governments would roll back the highest target of the Paris Agreement, which is keeping a global temperature rise no higher than 1.5 degrees centigrade this century. So that's the real safety line as far as science is concerned. And it was actually many businesses, 200 plus businesses, who signed a statement with lots of trade organizations and others, telling governments, no, you don't muck around with 1.5 as a target. In fact, it's not a target, it's a limit. And that voice, I think, was quite powerful. And in the end, 1.5 was kept alive, which rather than dying in Sharm el-Sheikh. I think important voices there from business and industry.
On the loss and damages fund, you mentioned, time will tell essentially on how impactful it is, given that we still need to rally a fair amount of commitments. There's a lot of work to be done this coming year. A committee has been set up that will be co-chaired by one country from the developed world, one from the developing. But, as you know, in COP15 in 2009, developed countries committed to mobilizing $100 billion annually and have consistently missed that target. And so I wonder, how should we think about the level of confidence in countries being able to meet these commitments, and how can more resources be mobilized?
Yeah, I mean, the $100 billion issue has dogged climate conferences ever since it was actually a number plucked from the air by Hillary Clinton, who had kind of plucked it from the air from a then former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who was thinking about, you remember when, of course, the COP in Copenhagen you referred to in 2009, when the big treaty should have been signed. We had to wait for Paris in 2015. That was just coming in the wake of the financial and economic crisis. And Gordon Brown plucked 100 billion out of the air as needed to deal with the financial and economic crisis. And 100 billion became a sort of, oh, well, if you need to deal with anything, it's 100 billion, right? So Hillary Clinton then said 100 billion for the developing countries in 2009. It's a strange one, isn't it? Because clearly the financial flows going on in the world to deal with climate change are much bigger than 100 billion. They have been for a long time. But this specific package for the developing countries, and particularly the vulnerable developing countries, not the Chinas of this world, but the more medium-sized or least developed countries, as they're sometimes called, this has became a big sticking point. And I never understood why the rich countries couldn't somehow marshal 100 billion and get that problem off their back. I mean, it seemed ridiculous to me for years. It's close to 100 billion, this package, but it's not quite there yet. So then, yes, you beg the question, what about the loss and damage fund? How much money might end up in that? And I think that's the tricky question, because there are many, many funds out there that have been created over many, many years. There's an adaptation fund, for example, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has always struggled to be filled with sufficient money to be relevant. You have other funds, like something called the Global Environment Facility in Washington that the rich countries pay into. It's been around since the early 1990s. It gets a slice, it gets a budget to do things on climate change, also to save species, biodiversity as it's called. And there's always a row about whether that has enough money. So whether the loss and damage fund will ever have enough money in it to make it absolutely credible will now be, I think, the argument for the coming years. I think that's to be seen. I mean, what I don't understand about loss and damage is, it's clear that we have to reduce the emissions. It's clear that we have to support the developing countries as well, who want to take part in reducing their emissions. And it comes in the forms of overseas development aid and export credits and all kinds of things. And then you've got loss and damage, which is a kind of an admission of failure in a sense in the climate story. But there's a big chunk in the middle that didn't really get talked about, and I don't know why it isn't being talked about. Maybe it will come, which is, what about insurance? Because, we all know if you live in many rich countries, many people get access to private insurance. So if something happens to their house, they can get it covered. And in many developing countries, when they're hit by extreme weather events, there's no public or private insurance for these people, particularly the poorest people. And yet small pilot projects that have been done in Africa, for example, I know the UK government did one, where you actually have early warnings of extreme weather events, and then you pay like an insurance thing out to local people before they get down to their last cow or their last, carrot or something like that, before they're starving. Actually, it's more cost effective than then having to bring in emergency aid to these people. So I don't understand why the insurance package isn't being talked about, whereby you deal with the first bit, which is funding or providing funding for developing countries to, in a sense, adapt, but also reduce their emissions. You have loss and damage at the end, but in the middle, there should be some insurance package, private and public. And then I think the loss and damage would be lower. And perhaps everybody would be more comfortable with this complexity of, an unlimited check for damage that will come in the future.
It's that old adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And to that point, also, there was a fair amount of frustration, particularly around members of the EU, that this COP failed to secure any major progress on mitigation and curbing emissions. Why do you think there was a lack of real conversation and movement in that area this year?
Well, I think that if you think about COP26, many countries did actually increase, or the last one last year did increase their ambition. There were a couple of countries that also increased their ambition at this COP in Egypt. Egypt itself brought forward the dates at which it will achieve certain emission reduction targets, for example. But I think it's quite hard to imagine governments raising ambition and then next year raising ambition further and raising ambition further. It's quite a hard lift. And I think that the tension here is that we've only got 8 years to halve our emissions. by 2030. And also the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientists that advise everybody about what's going on, said we have to peak global emissions in 2025. So we're really at a tight point. So you've got the kind of political dynamic of, can you really bump up your ambition every single year versus the urgency of kind of doing that? And I think this is where politics and science, struggle to align with political reality and scientific reality. I suppose the big question is can we imagine a world that was capable of halving its global emissions by 2030, given the fact the emissions are still going up? And I think that this is now whether we can actually see exponential growth in sectors of the decarbonization economy, you might say, renewable energy, electrification of transportation. Are they reaching exponential? Because if they're reaching exponential, some of them, in fact, we could suddenly go very, very fast. It's a bit like pushing a rock up a hill. You don't know where the summit is, but once it gets to the top, it rolls down very fast the other side. I think with renewable energy, it will happen. I think it's already doubling every 3 years. Some people say 2.5 years. So it is achieving Moore's law, which was the law for transistors with computers. I think that's starting to happen with the electrification of transportation. Other sectors are off track, like buildings are really still not really being decarbonized at the speed that needs to happen to achieve an exponential decarbonization pathway. But agriculture and nature could just be set for that, because I think one of the most interesting reports out of COP27 was a joint report by something called the Exponential Roadmap and by Conservation International on the potential for decarbonization that would achieve the 2030 halving of our emissions coming from nature and agriculture, regenerative agriculture generally. And that doesn't require any new technologies. The funding is relatively low to achieve it. And it is actually happening already, despite not being very visible, but became more visible, I think, at COP27.
And so the Paris Agreement established a goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It sounds like you have some hope that we might be able to maintain that if we can have some of these breakthrough innovations and accelerate that progress.
So I think renewable energy will achieve its part of the story. I think it's going so fast right now that within even a few years, that exponential growth could be really awesome. And I also think certainly within the European stage, although there's a lot of talk about in the wake of the Ukraine war, that, everyone's been struggling to get off Russian gas and sourcing, liquid petroleum gas, for example, from the Gulf states. But behind that story is absolutely, you can see a determination in quite a lot of European countries now to do something which in some ways is a bit of a failure, because Germany was absolutely leading on renewable energy for years, right? Other countries too. The UK has stepped up enormously. And then everyone kind of took their foot off I wouldn't say the gas, but off the pedal of the electric car, right? And slowed down how fast they were growing themselves. And I think this whole Ukraine situation has given a new energy, certainly in Europe, to moving faster. And I'm hoping that the new legislation in the USA from Biden will also give a big pump up for renewables. So I think renewables is going to deliver its part. I think electrification will deliver its part. And if we can just get ourselves on a faster track with agriculture and nature, I think we could see the halving of emissions by 2030. So I am not a green-eyed optimist, but I am an optimistic realist or a realistic optimist. I don't know which way it goes. But I think I felt a bit more confident after COP27 than I've felt for a while, actually.
And you've been part of multiple COPs, including the very first one in Berlin, Kyoto, and many others. How have the dynamics and focus areas changed over the years for you?
Well, I think the big change has been that, in the beginning, it was really just a rich country, developed country issue, and the developing countries couldn't see what was in it for them because they weren't producing many emissions. They were not asked to do any targets for self-evident reasons. And so it was kind of like just a rich country game of reducing emissions. But I think the big dynamics is that the science has just been unbelievably, consistent, clear, ever more terrifying, I would say. And I think that has accompanied a massive, complete change certainly from the early 1990s up to 2009 when we had the Copenhagen Conference. I think the thing about Copenhagen in 2009, when the big treaty should have been delivered of all nations, was I don't think the big developing countries like China and India and Brazil and Mexico and others, South Africa, I don't think they were quite sure then whether clean energy, renewable energy, would ever reach the kind of low prices that it's at right now, whether it was actually affordable to them, knowing that they still had to lift, hundreds of millions and billions of people out of poverty. So I think that was the shock of 2009. But between 2009 and 2015, you started seeing the numbers that, in fact, clean, green, renewable energy was approaching or had approached being as cheap as coal. And I think that gave a lot of incentive in Paris for even, some of the big developing countries to join Paris and say, yeah, we can do it. So I think that's been one of the great stories of that period of time. But I also think, you have to remember, I was a journalist on the Times newspaper in London in the 1990s. A unit of solar or wind or whatever was like $50 a unit. Right now, it's just cents. So I think we should celebrate that. But I think the big challenge has been to go from beginning a journey with, say, renewable energy to the point at which it actually becomes cost effective. And if we are going to solve this problem, we have to shorten the distance between things moving and things actually getting there to where they need to be. I think the other thing about the COPs is I think that what also has changed is that we all understand now that actually climate change cannot be fully resolved, and that we do have to adapt to our economies, and we do have to think more carefully about where we put infrastructure, where we put homes, where do we build things. And I think that's a big change as well. I think that still has a lot more to play out, actually. The other thing that I think that's changed is that we have seen a lot of the big, finance houses and also the investment funds suddenly realizing that, climate change also could be an opportunity. But where I think that game is right now is that they're kind of having it both ways. I think you're seeing money from private banks and asset managers and insurance and pension funds going more into the green space. But on the other side, they are trying to play it both ways, so they're betting on both. They're betting on a slow progression, so they still invest in the fossil fuel industry, or you might say or you might say the old economies, and yet they're also investing in the new economy. And I think this is also a big challenge right now. How do we hold the finance houses accountable for their promises and their pledges, which are only being half met right now?
And is that more regulation that changes the market dynamics and makes it even more palpable, I guess? Is it a mix of public-private financing?
I think it is about accountability. And I think the governments have been a bit sleeping at the wheel on this one. I think there have to be much stronger regulation, much stronger guidelines, and much stronger scrutiny of the claims that are made. Because if you go back in the last few years, you'd hear things like finance houses with $32.5 trillion are pledged to invest in the green economy. But then you ask kind of where it is. And then you see the same banks that are investing in the green economy, investing in ExxonMobil or Chevron, or even some saying they don't invest in the fossil fuel industry, but they invest in the refineries like Marathon in the United States. So this is about claims, so that if you and I invest in a fund that we say is a climate fund, if you invest in, for example, in BlackRock, you'll find that the assessments show that BlackRock, one of the big asset managers, have many climate funds. So you think you're doing the right thing, but actually only maybe two of them or less, whatever, are actually aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. The rest are still investing in, some of the dirty areas of the economy. So this has to be about regulation of claims and also regulations of pledges, I think. And there is movement on that. The former Environment Minister of Canada has been asked by the Secretary General to come to some conclusion on what are honest claims and what are claims that are having it both ways.
Zoning out to the broader realm of climate communications, you led communications for both the United Nations Environment Program as well as the UNFCCC. What were some of the major challenges in advancing climate communications at a global level?
Well, some of it was that we had to stop believing our own bullshit. We had to stop believing that when we produce a peer-reviewed scientific study on what needs to be done by so many people, and when that study is launched and that study gets lots of coverage by Associated Press, Reuters, Washington newspapers, London newspapers, all over the world, that somehow a job's been done. And I think I think we all thought that if we just kept pumping out, awesome reports on the threats, the economics of climate change, for example, or what does it mean to economies if you lose your forests? If you lose your pollinating insects that produce your food. There was I think we all thought that if we just kept going at that eventually the world would just change, to say, okay, yeah, the science is solid, right? So I think that was, I don't think we're alone in that as the UN Environment Programme or the UNFCCC, but it didn't really light the blue touch paper and see the rocket of transformation take off. So I think one of the things that I found over the time was I started saying to myself, why is it that this isn't happening? And I think one of the most bizarre, perhaps, and fascinating things about the world that we live in is that young people passing through school and then going to university or college or something are never really educated properly about these big environmental challenges. So every year, students are coming out with hardly any information on what is happening to their world. So therefore, you're not building a civil society movement of enough people to hold their governments accountable. And I think this holding governments accountable, because they're subject, as you know, to the political terms of office. I mean, the USA, it seems even more crazy, right? Somebody gets in for 2 years and then everyone's planning the next election, right? That these short-term cycles of politics and the long-term building of awareness and understanding of what's happening to the world, both those never really aligned. So I don't think that there's ever been until just recently an increasing civil society movement wanting change. And I think it would go faster if everyone was educated about these. So that's one thing that I think communications, certainly under the UNFCCC, we tried harder to do that towards the end, running up to Paris. I think the other things that have changed is that people do now seem to be turned off by the end of the world is nigh. And I think that was a card that was played quite heavily for many, many years to shock people into the reality. Understandably, the science was coming through. You have to shock people, right? To wake up. Something's going on. You need to do something about it. But I think as increasingly climate change has got even more worrisome in terms of the science, I think people have been, in some communities, and there is some evidence for this, have been getting depressed. And I think that we need a kick up. So, I mean, at COP27, I work for We Don't Have Time TV, but it's also a campaigning organization as well. We launched something called We Can Do It, which is a reflection not only of my later years at the UN, but also a sense that you need to make people think that we can achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement, that we can do it. And because, the Second World War, the leaders didn't say if we can beat Nazi Germany, right? It was like, no, we're going to do it. You have to believe you can do it. If you're going to swim a river, if you're Lewis Pugh, who's a long distance endurance swimmer, who has swum over the North Pole and has swum the Red Sea to get to COP27, if he thought he couldn't do it, then he probably wouldn't get there. So I think it's the same with climate change. Oh.
Lewis Pugh is great, and he's been a champion on our campaign to secure marine protection in the Southern Ocean too. And so, really moved by a lot of his work.
I just want to say, by the way, that when I was at UNEP, I appointed him as a UNEP Patron of the Oceans. And because I also thought he was marvelous and he's a great public speaker too.
Yeah, he is. As you mentioned, you're now working with a media and tech company called We Don't Have Time. Mm-hmm. What's the mission of the company?
We were set up about 5 or 6 years ago to try and bring a media channel that would be about climate change and environmental issues, and to try and show to the public, but also to policymakers and city leaders, well, anybody really, that in fact there's a lot more going on than you're aware of. And in terms of technological breakthroughs, startup companies, and also, civil society as well, stepping up, and youth. So it was about trying to show and reveal to the world that we're not starting from ground zero in tackling these problems, and to get on board, get optimistic, get things done, be a part of the action. Because I think it was felt that a lot of media companies were a bit like the finance sector right now, having it both ways. You can pick up a newspaper with a front page saying climate change is serious, we should do something about it, and then turn to the travel section where it says, why don't you go skiing with a cheap ticket with Lufthansa to the Austrian Alps, which seems like a bit of a contradiction in terms. So I think we wanted to bring forward, just a resolute sense of what we need to do to give a kick up the arse to some of those sectors of the economy that aren't doing very well. So we run a big mini-series with the UNDP on another great absurdity of the world, which is fossil fuel subsidies, to try and reveal how they get into all aspects of the global economy. So sometimes we look at things that are real problems that need to be solved. And we also look at a lot of things that where human creativity and ingenuity in response to these emergencies, like climate change, loss of species, how that is rising up and being expressed through startups or even large corporations completely changing their business models. You look at a Danish oil company that now is 100% renewable energy, for example. I mean, that's a good story. They're called Ørsted. Yeah. We did actually set it up as well to be a social media channel that would mean that instead of, Facebook, where your big hits are if you've got a cat, a kitten playing with wool, that you get a big hit. We wanted to be a place where you could be a big hit if you demonstrated that you could, decarbonize the whole public transport sector. But that doesn't seem quite as sexy as kittens with cotton wool. We're still moving forward with our social media channels, but the broadcasting has really taken off. We get about 10 million viewers in 160 countries, and it's really been growing in the last 5 years.
And I know you try to marry both the awareness with action, but also some of the realism and the urgency of the issue with optimism about the potential for having a better future. What are some of the actions people can take on the platform?
So what we like to do is there's about 75,000 organizations, companies and individuals on the platform, and they can post a climate love, we call it a climate love, it's a little green heart, to people or companies or whatever that they're doing a good thing. And then if they feel there's something going on that they think is wrong, they can post a climate warning. And enough people on the platform think this is really serious, then that will generate a communication with the organization concerned or the company concerned or the political leader. And if enough agree even further, this will lead to a lot of social media about this problem. And interestingly enough, actually, we do get responses. I mean, the former President Bolsonaro of Brazil got a climate warning of sufficient numbers on his use of pesticides in the Amazon that he actually wrote back and said, well, this really wasn't very fair, he said, because Brazil was only like the 5th worst user of pesticides in the world. But I mean, for example, I did an article for the platform about how some banks were funding drilling off Barbados for oil within the last 12 months. Barclays Bank and lots of others. And they were all B corporations. And, B Corp is meant to be about doing good in the world. And that got so much response that it triggered a communication with the B Corporation. And they promised that they would now look at members who maybe might be doing things that weren't in line with climate action. So yeah, it does generate some interesting interrelationships and back and forth, which is a bit unlike any other social media platform of its kind.
We've covered a lot of ground. I just wanted to give you a chance, if you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to leave folks with.
Yeah, I think one of the important things is I think that the legal avenue will, I think, over the coming years be pursued even more. When a country, UK, USA, Brazil, anybody adopts any of these big UN agreements, they do get devolved into legislation, national legislation. And I think there are a few examples where citizens have been holding their own governments to account. The Netherlands, for example. I think Nepal as well, citizens have held. In other words, you've got a target to do something, government. You put it in your national legislation, but you're not meeting it. And I think in the past, people thought UN treaties were, they called it soft law. You couldn't really, the legal route was really complex. It is complex, but I think you're now seeing lawyers coming through that understand that governments can be held responsible for the agreements that they sign that are devolved into national legislation, and if they don't meet them, that the public in those countries can hold them to account. So I think that the legal pathway will increasingly become something of interest to us all. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for sharing so much insight and all of your experience over the years. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's been a great pleasure to be on your broadcast.
Thanks so much, Nick, for sharing your experience at the forefront of climate communications and media. I'll leave links to where you can find Nick and We Don't Have Time in the show notes, which you can find at only.one/Upwell. Once again, that's only.one/Upwell. This week's episode was engineered by Jake Bowles, research was supported by Serena Cooper, and our cover art was designed by Joanna Marcus at Only.one. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and start your journey to help save the ocean and fix the climate today at only.one. For as little as $9, you can start planting coral and mangroves and removing plastics and carbon. Again, that's www.only.one. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with an all-new episode of Upwell.